Hi everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. In this latest installment of Conversations with Terryl Givens, Terryl is joined by McKay Coppins, a highly respected young political commentator and writer, widely known for his back and forths with Donald Trump over the past several years. Coppins recently published a truly remarkable piece in The Atlantic titled The Most American Religion, which is both a retrospective on the place of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in American consciousness and a look forward to the 3rd century of the Church and its place in American culture. As part of writing this piece, Coppins was granted a rare face-to-face sit-down with President Russell M. Nelson to discuss a wide range of topics. We think you'll enjoy this conversation between two very insightful Latter-day Saint thinkers. We should also note that Terryl and Fiona Givens have just published a groundbreaking new book titled All Things New, Rethinking Sin, Salvation, and Everything in Between. It's available at Desert Book and on Amazon. We think anyone who has enjoyed these conversations with Terryl will love this book. Tim and I have spent a lot of time with it and found its insights to be truly life-changing. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed this episode.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Conversations with Terryl Givens, sponsored by the Faith Matters Foundation. I'm your host, Terryl Givens, and today have a guest with us who many of you know him either by name or probably in more cases by some of his writings and political coverage, McKay Coppins, who has come to the attention of a fair number of Latter-day Saints very recently because of his authorship of an article just released in January 2021 of The Atlantic, called The Most American Religion. So how's your reception been to that article so far, McKay?
It's been really good. It's actually been sort of overwhelming. It's funny. My biggest fear initially when I was working on it was that it would be rejected by all factions of the Latter-day Saint world for being either too orthodox or not orthodox enough, or for my insistence on using the word Mormon, which I know is now very controversial. And then in the immediate run-up to the publication, I was actually most worried that just nobody would read it, and it would be seen as kind of an exercise in self-indulgence and kind of dismissed. But a lot of people have read it. There's been great response, lots of thoughtful responses, and it's been heartening to see the kind of conversation that people have had around it.
Good. Well, I'll have to say that I was surprised that it got through the editors because it was devoid of the usual kind of sarcasm and condescension that one has found so much recently, especially in the political press. McKay, why don't you start us off by giving us a bit of an introduction? Actually, I should introduce a few things about you. You've been a staff writer at The Atlantic for a while. Back in 2012, you received a number of plaudits, right? You were recognized as, trying to find my cheat sheet here. Forbes pointed you out as one of the 30 under 30 media pundits. You were listed as one of Politico's 10 breakout reporters of 2012. You're a regular contributor to a number of news hours. So tell us a little bit about how you got into journalism, and tell us too how your faith, how your affiliation with the LDS Church has had an impact, if it has, on your work.
Yeah, it's funny that 30 under 30 thing is really a double-edged sword, because it was cool when it came out, and now that I'm over 30, I feel like it's like faintly embarrassing anytime it gets mentioned in a bio.
I wasn't going to say you were over 30 now, but
back in my youthful days, I was a 30 under 30. Yeah, so I grew up in Massachusetts, this kind of suburbs of Boston, and was one of those people that knew what I wanted to do pretty early on. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was, very young. And then journalism kind of came onto my radar. I think when I was in high school, I took in my freshman year a journalism class. And ever since then, I've been wanting to work in this field. I went to BYU.
You were editor of the Daily Universe at BYU, right?
I was, yeah. I was editor of the Daily Universe. Had some great professors there. John Hughes, who was not a Latter-day Saint, but was the former editor of the Deseret News, kind of steered me toward national media and said I should try to make it in New York. And through BYU, actually got an internship at Newsweek magazine, which turned into a job. And that's where I spent my first couple of years of journalism, and then joined BuzzFeed News to cover the 2012 election, and wrote a book about Republican politics, and I'll yada 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 through the rest of it. But ended up at the Atlantic right around the time Donald Trump was sworn in, and I primarily cover politics, though, as you noted, faith has always been kind of a preoccupation of mine, obviously my personal life, but also journalistically. I've always been interested both in how faith intersects with politics, and not for kind of the typical ways that I think a lot of journalists focus on it. I'm actually interested in, one of the things I'm most interested in about politics is how ideals clash with ambition or careerism, and kind of the tension between those two things in political leaders. And that's often, religion is kind of where those tensions are found. And so I've written a lot about religion and politics, but especially Mormonism and politics, because I covered the Romney campaign.
Yeah, I was going to say the Romney campaign was a pretty good case study in that tension, collision, right, dynamic between faith and politics. And I want to talk about Romney and your coverage of that campaign a little bit. I just want to insert one kind of, question/comment first. And that is, I'm wondering if you have any achievement in your life that you are prouder of in your Twitter feud with Donald Trump back in, a few years ago.
Geez, I have many achievements in my life that I'm prouder of, but I don't know if there are any achievements that have gotten me more attention, sadly. I think especially outside of kind of Mormondom, that might be the single thing I'm best known for. I'm actually wrapping up a piece about that for the Atlantic now, kind of looking back on the Trump era and my ambivalence, because I'm very conflicted about the fact that the Trump era has been so good for my career and for a lot of journalists' career. And so it's kind of me talking to journalists as we grapple with that. But yeah, Donald Trump and I have a history of not getting along great, and I won't go into the whole story, but I basically I profiled him back in 2014 as he was considering running for president, and kind of ended up marooned at Mar-a-Lago because a blizzard shut down LaGuardia, and I ended up spending a couple days there with him and wrote about the experience being kind of inside Trump's Xanadu. And he didn't like the story and lashed out at me and called me names, and it is probably in political media circles the thing I'm best known for.
Well, McKay, I'm sorry that you will be deprived of that dimension of your journalistic life as of January going forward.
I know that story loses a lot of value the second that he leaves office.
Well, let's jump right into your experience in the Romney campaign. There's one comment you made in the Atlantic article that I'd like to kind of launch from. You said that as the only Latter-day Saint in the Romney campaign press corps, you said, I was in a unique position to watch him squirm as he confronted several issues regarding the church. And then you say, quote, and I often made it harder for him. So I'm curious what you mean by that, and was that intentional?
It's funny, that was a note my editor had too. She asked if I was trying to make it hard for him. I don't know that I was trying to, make his candidacy harder for him. But what I meant by that is that the Romney campaign, especially in 2012, made a calculated decision basically not to talk about religion, at least through the Republican primaries. They sort of started to bring it up more at the Republican convention once he had secured the nomination, and the backlash from conservative evangelicals wasn't as much of a fear. But for most of the election year, Mitt Romney had kind of a rule that he would not say much of anything about the church on the campaign trail. And his consultants kind of rigidly policed this. Anytime a reporter was doing a story on the church or his faith, they kind of refused comment and told reporters, go ask the church. That's not a question for us. And I guess the way that I made it harder for him is that I just wrote about Mormonism constantly in 2012. I wrote about the way that it shaped Mitt Romney's worldview. I wrote about the way his candidacy was being interpreted by members of the church. I also wrote a lot of kind of explainers just about basic tenets of Latter-day Saint culture and doctrine. So I wrote about what baptisms for the dead actually were when that became a minor controversy on the campaign trail. I wrote an explainer about garments, which actually became one of my most read pieces my entire career because so many people were curious about it at the time. This was before the church kind of put up their own explainer and put more information out there.
Do you think the rigid demarcation that he imposed between his spiritual commitments and his political role ultimately worked against him?
I think that it made it much harder to see him as an authentic human being. I think that the big, strike against him throughout 2012 was that he seemed like an automaton or a robot, and a lot of people thought he was phony or artificial. And I think that was largely because the core of his identity, the thing that actually was at the center of who he was his faith, and his refusal. I don't want to say refusal as though it, was, people were calling on him to do it. I was calling on him to do it, but his decision not to talk about his faith made it harder to kind of present himself as a fully rounded out person. And I think in retrospect, it might have helped, though. In 2008, he did talk about it more, and he received an enormous amount of backlash, anti-Mormon bigotry on the campaign trail from the right and the left. And so I understand why he was reluctant. And in fact, the more time I spent covering his campaign, the more I understood his reluctance. But I do think it ultimately probably hurt him.
Right. There's a comment you made in connection with your discussion about Romney and that presidential cycle. This comment seems to be one that has general applicability to the church and not to him personally. But you talk about this kind of craving that Latter-day Saints have for acceptance. And, in my own work, I've talked about this in its historical dimension, and I see it as one of these paradoxes, one of these tensions that on the one hand, as Latter-day Saints, we celebrate, right, this elect status, right? We're, this chosen, Zion and these people with this special commission. And on the other hand, we feel the pain of exile. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of want to have it both ways, right? We want to be special, but we also want to be part of the club, invited to all the parties.
We're a peculiar people, but also don't call us peculiar, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. One interesting way in which that kind of plays out is in the LDS response to the musical, right? The Book of Mormon musical. And I had kind of the same response that you did. At first, I thought, man, I'm really proud of the fact that instead of getting all defensive and heard about it, right? The church just says, well, you've seen the musical, now read the book.
Yeah.
But more cynical observers say, well, we don't have enough cultural cachet to really protest these kinds of misrepresentations, right? One Jewish pundit once commented that Mormons are the only religious group that is still politically correct to demonize or ridicule. Is that changing, do you think, in any way?
I think that idea has started to be internalized by more people in kind of elite sectors of American life. Like that exact thing that you just read, that comment, the idea that we're the last group that it's fair to demonize. I think I've heard that from a number of people over the past few years. But, it's funny because that, I remember feeling that same conflicted, that ambivalence about the musical, which was like, I listened to the soundtrack. I was never able to get tickets, but I listened to the soundtrack because I felt like I needed to know about it. And I understood that it was funny and, the songs were well written and clever. And I was also exasperated that people were going to see this and feel like they understood Mormonism, which was absurd to me. But I wanted to be a good sport. And I feel like a lot of people felt that way, but at least in my circles, I was living in Brooklyn at the time. I felt like it was not only did you have to be a good sport with like your non-Mormon friends when they asked about it, even with like other members of the church in Brooklyn, I felt like it was not cool to say like, actually that musical is annoying. Like I was kind of offended by that. Like you weren't really allowed to say that. And I think it's because we enforce this same thing with each other, none of us wants to be seen as humorless or overly defensive. And there is kind of a persecution complex that runs through Mormonism that I think is unhealthy. But, at the same time, I think we should be able to stand up for ourselves, and we shouldn't be so worried about how we're going to be viewed when something offends us. And that's not to say everyone has to have the same response to the musical that I did, but
right.
The question that you asked, I don't know, what's your perception of this? Like, do you think that it's changing? I have anecdotal data points in my life to suggest that people are understanding that it's not, cool to make fun of Mormons. And I will say one quick thing is, after this story came out, one of the funniest responses I've gotten is a bunch of people coming out of the woodwork from throughout my life, reporters who I covered the Romney campaign with, people that I've worked with in the past, to apologize to me if they ever said anything about my faith that was, impolite or offensive or whatever, which I appreciated, and assured them that I didn't feel like they owed me an apology. But I do feel like, some people have started to even come to that acknowledgement in the last, few days since the story's published. But I'm curious about what you think. Do you think that it's changing?
I don't think it's changing. I think that the healthiest development is that we no longer obsess about it as Latter-day Saints. For a long time, that kind of victimization has been part of our self-perception and representation. I think many of us, with a kind of historical consciousness, have believed that it was getting much better. And then you have people like Damon Linker and others, right, in the Romney election cycle saying, well, I think actually we should be imposing a religious test.
Yeah.
So it was, and Jane Barnes publishing, New York op-eds in which she says that, that if a Mormon is elected, then he'll be taking his instruction from Salt Lake. I mean, I wrote a book on 19th century anti-Mormonism, and I was appalled by how closely, right, the rhetoric coming
it's amazing
from journalists, it paralleled the 19th century, right, hysteria. I was just surprised that nobody claimed we were still sacrificing infants on the Salt Lake Temple as they did in 1860. But it, like I said, I think there's been a kind of maturing on our part to just shrug it off and get on.
I think that's happening. You're right about that. I still think we could move more in that direction. And even institutionally, sometimes I find myself wishing that we weren't so hyper attuned to external validation. I think that I understand it. I still feel it. It's like deep in my DNA that I want validation for my faith. I want us to be seen as respectable. And I understand the institutional interests there, and the church has a lot of reasons to care about that. But I do find myself sometimes wishing that we would just, ease off a little bit from the constant PR and the, concern about how we look and what various factions of the world think of us, and focus more on just our mission and what we think the faith should be. Yeah.
Amen. Amen to that. There are two major topics that I really want to get your take on as we move into what I think is kind of the heart and meat of your essay. First, the first topic has to do with the interconnectedness of the Latter-day Saints, at least as an American Latter-day Saint culture, and the Republican Party, and how we're really at a historic inflection point, right? That I think we've seen taking root in the Trump era. And you've written a book on the future of the Republican Party. So you probably have spent more time thinking about this than a lot of other scholars and commentators. But the affiliation of Latter-day Saints with Republicans became pretty deeply entrenched, right, in the 1960s, I think, at least that's my take, largely as a response to the sexual revolution. And there was a growing convergence between Latter-day Saint norms of sexual morality and the Republican Party's ostensible defense of family values.
Yep.
And that seemed destined for a very prolonged future until suddenly things began to fall apart with Trump's campaign. For me, one of the most tragic moments in the modern church's history was that moment when, Noah Feldman, the scholar at Harvard, he wrote, do you remember the editorial he wrote in which he called Mormons the moral conscience of the nation for repudiating Trump?
Yeah.
And this was in the pre-election polls.
Yep.
And then Utah ended up going for Trump, but not with anywhere near the level of enthusiasm that most conservative states did. So you say this in your essay. You say the Trump era has left many Mormons, once the most reliable Republican voters in the country, feeling politically homeless. Right? My personal take is that we should have always been feeling politically homeless.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
But you say they've begun to identify as moderate in growing numbers. So do you think this is a shift that is going to be valid for the long term?
I do, but with some caveats, right? I think that what we saw in the Trump era could end up being a fluke. It could end up being, in retrospect, a visceral response to a party standard bearer who was so brazenly out of step with our values, in his mean-spiritedness and vulgarity and name calling and immigrant bashing and his marital, his various immorality throughout his life. It could end up being that Latter-day Saints just couldn't stomach him, or at least some couldn't stomach him, and they'll return to partisanship. But I think when you talk to political scientists and you talk to scholars, they will point to some data points that suggest this could be a longer-term realignment that we're seeing. Basically that if you look at the rising generations of Latter-day Saints, they're much less enamored of the GOP, much less enamored of party politics in general than past generations, even at this period. And I would also say that a lot of this is tangled up in the future of the Republican Party, right? So if the Republican Party continues to follow leaders like Donald Trump, if it remakes itself as a kind of nationalist, immigration restrictionist party that is obsessed with culture war, I think that stuff will not play as well with Latter-day Saints as your, Mitt Romney's and John McCain's and even George W. Bush's. I think, but yeah, I don't know. It's like this is the question I keep getting asked: are Mormon voters just going to go back to the GOP? And I don't know. I think that it's a really interesting question. What I will say is that the fact that there's been any movement at all in the Latter-day Saint vote is just shocking to a lot of political scientists who study this stuff, because it is so rare to see anything like a 10-point swing, 20-point swing within a religious demographic, let alone the 30-point swing that happened in 2016, where Latter-day Saints effectively fielded their own protest candidate in Evan McMullen. I think that we have to, while acknowledging that a lot of them did vote for Donald Trump, a majority voted for Donald Trump, the delta is what's interesting to me. The changes or the shifts are what's interesting. And I think that it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the next election, assuming Donald Trump is not the Republican nominee then.
Right. I want to go back and just make a point of clarification. You as a journalist know how easy it is to take things out of context, but I just want to clarify what I meant by talking about that. What I saw as that tragic moment in our history was when it's not about who ultimately Mormons voted for. It's about the fact that Noah Feldman was noting that a large percentage of the Mormon populace were uneasy, were uncomfortable, and were disturbed by the kind of rhetoric and the kind of positions that Trump was taking. That's what I was referring to, and the fact that seemed to shift. You've given me a perfect segue now to transition into what I really want to spend most of our time talking about, and it arises out of this comment you made. You say, when I talk with my fellow Mormons about what our faith's third century might look like, one common fear is that the church will end up following the religious right into endless culture war. that would indeed be grim. But just as worrisome to me, you say, and perhaps more likely, is the prospect of a fully diluted Mormonism. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think you are just dead on target with your acknowledgement that the vitality of Mormonism in large degree derives from what Rodney Stark refers to as this tension with the dominant culture, right? Mm-hmm. And that's always been a characteristic. And if you'll indulge me, I want to just talk a little bit about history, about what I see as the successive manifestations of this tension that Latter-day Saintism maintained with the dominant culture. The first, I believe, was what I would call religious atavism. And let me explain what I mean by that. When Mormonism emerges on the scene in 1830, so this is before polygamy, right? Most historians say, oh, polygamy created, all the tensions. No, that wasn't there in 1830 or 38. But what was this religious atavism. By that I mean the reincorporation into religion of all of the forms of charismata, right? Angels and gold plates and speaking in tongues and healing and all of these gifts. As Charles Dickens mocked at one point, these Mormons believe in miracles in the age of railways. And so that was, I think, was a major source of this cultural tension and divide, was that Americans did not want to take seriously a religion that reenacted first century Christianity.
Yeah.
And, that tension has died out because Mormons are no longer charismatic, right? We no longer celebrate or promulgate this sense that we are in communion with spirits and angels and all these kinds of things. The second source of that tension, I think, was theocracy, as Latter-day Saints moved to Utah and they're instituting a theocratic government, right? Mohammedism in Utah was how a lot of critics referred to this, or they also would compare us to the Jesuitism of the Catholics, all of these, the infiltration of religion by politics. Well, that's pretty much been largely dissipated, although it reemerged with Romney, this fear, right, that we're mingling politics and religion, but that's largely gone. Third, of course, you have polygamy. That becomes the most easily manipulated kind of image of a kind of an alien religion. And then fourth was the tension that emerges, as I said, in the 1960s, as American culture becomes more and more progressive in terms of sexual ethics. And we re-entrench with this very conventional, traditional morality. Where are we now? You point out that the great elephant in the room now is the LGBT question, which functions very well as another source, right, of this cultural divide. One of the last traditions to maintain fidelity to heteronormative marriage and do it in a very public and official way has been the Latter-day Saint leadership. And yet it's never been as divisive within the Latter-day Saint community. No other source of differentiation has. So I haven't given you a very focused question, but I want you to tell me, what do you mean when you say you are afraid of us becoming fully diluted as a response to cultural pressure?
Yeah. Well, so this is the big question, and the reason that I don't get into the answer in great detail in the story is because I don't really have the answer yet. I'm still thinking through it, and as I think the church
well, that's the only reason we asked you onto the podcast.
I'm sorry. Should we just end it now? I'm sorry. I don't have the answer for how to stay in touch. I mean, look, I think that what I write in the piece and what I believe is that it should be hard to be a Latter-day Saint. It should not be easy and comfortable and the same as belonging to the Rotary Club. No offense to Rotarians out there, but this is why I think that as great as it would be for me, as easy as it would be for me, a late night writer who also has young kids, to be able to drink coffee. I am glad that there is a coffee prohibition. I think that this is a very small token. It's a small sacrifice, but it has, like all small sacrifices, a sanctifying effect. And I think that it's also a constant reminder that I'm supposed to be living a little bit differently than I would if I was just following my, the path of least resistance in my modern life. Not drinking, church callings, going to church with people who I wouldn't otherwise, spend a lot of time with is a huge, element of Mormonism that I think is really important and used to be kind of normal and is now somewhat countercultural. I don't believe in being in tension with the broader culture just for the sake of the tension, right? Like there can be places where we're in tension with the culture in unhealthy ways or in ways that do more harm than good. But I just don't think that that the ultimate answer all the time is for the church to just follow whatever public opinion polls say on any given question, and that's the ongoing restoration. I think that to be a Latter-day Saint means to be in tension with the culture in some ways. Now, I don't think that means that we have to cling to dogmas that hurt people and are painful and aren't productive. I'm not saying that everything that the church believes right this instant, every position that it holds right now needs to stay the same. I believe in evolution and progress. I just think that as we figure out the way forward, I hope that we still cling to this idea that we have to have a faith that demands something of us. And that's what I'm afraid of us losing.
So here's a question for you. In assuming that we can bracket the church's family proclamation, just for the purpose of conversation, let's just bracket that. What other examples can you think of that could serve the same function of putting us in a position of a conspicuous tension with dominant American culture, to speak of America in particular?
Yeah, it's funny. As you were speaking, I was thinking, there are all kinds of things that can put a religious tradition in tension with the broader culture. We could stop using electricity. We could, we could retreat from modern life entirely. I'm not calling for that. I think that, and this is sad to me that this is in tension with the broader culture, but doubling and tripling down on kind of the old-fashioned communitarianism that the church adheres to might become more and more antithetical to the way that the world is, or at least that America is,
I love that idea. I think that there's never been a moment when the contrast would be more powerful than if we Latter-day Saints were to repudiate the extremes of rhetoric and verbal violence against one another that we're replicating in the present moment.
Oh yeah. Well, and even during the pandemic, when so much of church has migrated online, one of the this isn't a huge fear that I have, but one of the fears I have is people self-sorting into Zoom congregations. They might not call them wards, but they function as kind of, discussion groups or whatever. And they're more progressive or more conservative or tailored to a certain set of politics or ideals. And that's all fine. And I seek out people who agree with me too, to have conversations. But I also think that one of the most radical things about Mormonism right now, and one of the great things about Mormonism, is that I have to go to church with people whose political views I abhor, and I have to go to church with people who see the world entirely different from me, who have had radically different experiences from me, that I don't only have to sit in pews with them, but that I might have to serve in, presidencies with them and put on events with them and, go do service projects with them. And I know that this stuff sounds kind of trite, and certainly to Latter-day Saints, I think we take for granted how these aspects of our culture, but they are so different from so much of the country right now. And
well, they're different. Yeah, no, I think this is I think this is actually one of the real marks of genius of the Restoration, was geographically rigidly
Yes.
enforced
Yeah.
boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
constituting wards where we can't parish shop. And Gene England wrote a magnificent essay, "Why the
Yep.
Church is as True as the Gospel,"
Yeah.
where he points to that. And
Yep.
yeah, it becomes a genuine school of love for
Mm-hmm.
that reason. Yeah, I think that's great. I want to turn now to one final topic, and I'm going to preface it by saying one of the real principles of religion that Fiona and I have really tried to promulgate and enact in our own writing is the indissoluble connection between theology and practice.
Mm.
And I think there's a public
Yep.
perception in the minds of many that, well, theology, that's just doctrine, right? Like Jewel sings, in the end, only kindness matters, right? And I want to say, no. The way you define God conditions how you see
Mm-hmm.
other people. And I think there's a theology of love that is complex and profound, that is inherent in Restoration principles that we've never kind of fleshed out and articulated fully. And here it seems to me is another example where we've really been deficient on this front, and it comes to the LGBT question. I'm going to quote one final time from your article where you put the question to President Nelson, right? What is the future for LGBT people? And he said, "As apostles of the Lord, we cannot change God's law. We teach his laws. He gave them many thousands of years ago, and I don't expect he'll change them now." Well, aside from the fact that that's certainly not what a lot of people wanted to hear him say, here's the question I have, which is, it seems to me that one reason why we're not having a productive conversation about sexuality and marriage in the church is because on the one side, you see the brethren, I think, at least very conspicuously and very dramatically working to reform our language, our rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
the way we try to embrace all people, and acknowledging that sexual orientation is not a choice in many cases, that there clearly is a genetic component, right? These, it seems to me, are enormously important strides, clearly not enough in the minds of many. What saddens me is that on the other side of this issue, there isn't more recognition that the brethren have to operate within certain theological constraints. And I guess I'm wondering, why do you think they aren't invoked more often? I'll give an example. One of my children was in graduate school at the time of Prop 8, and some of her colleagues were good enough to ask, with at least a modicum of good intent, how can you possibly justify your opposition to gay marriage? And her answer was, well, you have to understand that we have a theology that involves a heavenly mother, an idea of eternal increase, and right? And she said, at this point, these people who until that moment had been very hostile, at least they could say, oh, at least it makes sense now, right? At least it can't just be dismissed as homophobia. There's a whole theological framework that has to be accommodated. And yet we never seem to approach the problem with that recognition that there are competing imperatives. What do you think?
Yeah, well, let me answer this first as a journalist who spent a lot of time this year interviewing members of the church, from President Nelson to scholars to historians to, just rank and file members of the faith. I think that a lot of people feel that they don't have to engage with the doctrinal and theological questions because they assume that it can be reversed, the policy, the teachings on sexuality can be reversed the same way that the priesthood ban was reversed on black men, right? They see this as kind of the sequel to that saga, which is the church was out of step with progressive values and pressure mounted, and then they announced that they were reversing course. So I think that that's to answer your specific question of why there isn't as much engagement on the theology. I think that that's part of the reason. I will say there are some people who engage in the theology and try to make a doctrinal case for why these things can change the church's teachings on
there are some scholars doing that.
But it, in terms of the rank and file people engaging in the debate, I think that's part of why. I guess what I would say is that if you look for the most part at the history of the church, in where they have made reforms and changes, the kinds of changes that I think a lot of progressives are hoping for, those changes don't happen without some kind of doctrinal theological scaffolding to support them, right? They're usually
exactly.
There usually isn't just an abrupt 180 without any explanation. And whether you think that should happen or not, it's just practically speaking, it's not how it's happened in the past. And so
right.
I think that if you were trying to convince, if not this generation of leaders, then the next generation of leaders of the church to change the way they think about these issues and even change the church's approach to these issues, you have to come at it with a common understanding of the doctrine and how the doctrine is currently being interpreted and how it could be interpreted in a different way. But you can't just bracket doctrine and set it aside and then exert pressure. Just, practically speaking, I just don't think that that's how it generally happens in the church.
That's right. It's certainly not how it happened in the case of blacks, the priesthood ban, right? First of all, there had to be a lot of historical work accomplished to excavate the past and demonstrate that, no, actually Joseph Smith did ordain blacks to the priesthood. There was a precedent.
Yep.
And actually giving them the priesthood is consistent with the scriptural record, not inconsistent with it. So you're right. The whole doctrinal framework had to be seen as supportive of that change, which I'd like to remind people was a return, not an innovation.
Right.
And so the same comparable kind of work would have to be done in this case. You can't just declare, okay, tomorrow we're going to do this, unless it makes sense in light of the larger theological framework.
Well, and especially because I just want to say, and not to cut you off, but just an interesting note I think that could help this conversation is that when I interviewed President Nelson, it's very clear to me that this is not a purely political issue to him. It's just not. It's, he sees this as doctrinal. And I think the brethren, for the most part, the church leaders, general authorities, see this as doctrine. And so, again, if the audience that you're looking to persuade is church leaders, I just don't think you can come at that conversation without engaging on their terms. I think that's the way that it's going to happen. If it
right.
is,
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. Okay, it's been great to talk with you today. Is there any topic you wish we had touched on that we didn't?
No, I'm glad that we were able to do this. I hope that you didn't hear my kids screaming too much in the background, but that is
no, we didn't.
That I'm glad to hear it, and thank you so much for having me on. I mentioned this to you before we started, but I saw you speak at the MTC when I was a missionary, however many years ago that was, and we, as I recall it, the missionaries in in our district were passing notes back and forth with our very wise 19-year-old insights into the talk you were giving. And so you left an impression on a group of 19-year-old boys who are entering the mission field. So I'm very glad to have been able to have this conversation with you now all these years later.
Well, thanks, McKay. I appreciate hearing that. Yes, that was a very memorable occasion when I was invited to give a fireside, and it was apparent to me that the missionaries appreciated it more than the presidency did. So I think we're a little scandalized by some of the history that I excavated in that fireside. But to me, that was really a formative moment, because that I experienced that at a time before Fiona and I really began our work of publishing these books together. But what it told me was that there's an enormous thirst and hunger among the general membership to excavate more deeply and more honestly into our doctrine and our history.
Yep.
And so that's what we've been trying to do ever since.
Well, and I can say that, I don't remember exactly what you brought up, but anything you brought up, we heard that and much more once we entered the field. So I think one place where I think the church has made some progress in the past decade or so is an understanding that you can't shield members from the history, right? We're members of the church are going to confront it, whether or not the church wants them to. And so it's better to deal with it honestly within the institution. But,
absolutely. And I'm hoping for the day when that becomes part of the MTC training program.
Yeah.
Is not just memorize discussions, but to verse them in the unsanitized history of our tradition and doctrine. McKay, I think the church is lucky to have a person of your stature and faithfulness that can represent our tradition at times with an accurate and thoughtful and faithful voice. So thank you for your good work.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for doing this
today. So long.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this conversation with Terryl Givens and McKay Coppins. To purchase all things new, Terryl and Fiona's new book, just head to Amazon or Deseret Book. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can find more at faithmatters.org.